Hi, I'm Paul Verschuur, and today with my colleagues Jenna Bednar and Andreas Roepstorff, we're speaking with Robert Axelrod about the foundations of collaboration. Professor Robert Axelrod is a political scientist and the William D. Hamilton Distinguished University Professor Emeritus at the University of Michigan. Robert has been the author of many scientific articles and especially the 1981 paper The Evolution of Cooperation, co-authored with Bill Hamilton, is considered a classic in the field. It is the Convergent Science and Instrument Forum podcast on collaboration. And today, me, Paul Verschuur, with my colleagues Jenna Bednar and Andreas Roepstorff, are talking with Robert Axelrod on the topic of collaboration. So welcome, Robert.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
So Robert, just to start off, could you give us a short description of your professional trajectory to give us a bit of a sense where you're coming from and where you are now and all the steps in between that matter to our conversation?
Sure. Well, I'm a political scientist who have long been interested in international security affairs and often use agent-based modeling and game theory to study and analyze such situations. I've also been interested in evolutionary biology and have used some evolutionary concepts in my political science work. I'm at the University of Michigan. I've recently retired, but I'm still active. Excuse me. I had many collaborations. One with an evolutionary biologist, William Hamilton, and more recently with an oncologist, cancer expert, Kenneth Pienta. We can talk about those or others. Would you like more elaboration on my career?
No, look, whatever you feel is relevant as an introduction. So it's really up to you. I'm
that's
not
fine.
going to sway you one way or the other. But if you think that's enough as a start, then we're ready to go. So,
okay.
So the topic is collaboration. So what is it and what is it good for?
Well, in an academic setting where I am, collaboration often takes the form of two or more scholars or students working on a single project with the hope that that they can do something that none of them could have done alone. And in many cases in my career, they've been interdisciplinary collaborations. I mean, as a political scientist, I worked with somebody from outside political scientists or even outside the social sciences.
But in some sense, you now give an example of where it occurs. But in some sense, the question would now be, what are really the defining features? Right? What makes something a collaboration?
I think the basic defining feature is two or more people working on the same problem with mutual support, as opposed to kind of completely independently and sewing it together at the end.
Mm-hmm. But then you could argue that, okay, we have cooperative systems and collaborative systems, so why don't we just give them one label? Because there, in all cases, we have agents doing things together. Right, so it seems that there are more nuances here at work. So what would these be?
Well, as I think collaborative efforts tend to be cooperative. So I think collaboration is a subset, but it is exploiting the differences between the participants, the different things they bring to it, the diversity of talents and background and perspectives and goals. Whereas cooperation could be, for example, it's just I trade something with you and you give me money, and so cooperation is a much broader term. And certainly, we usually think of collaboration as necessarily human, although you could say that ants collaborate as well.
But now, would that difference be, let's say that there's, in the collaboration case, an explicitly defined goal, in the cooperation case, there's some happenstance interaction of exchange. Is that what you're going to?
Yeah, collaboration typically involves, as I've said, a common purpose and the development of a common product, something that they achieve together. And it also typically involves some specialization, people having different things that they bring to the team.
So now, with your background, also, as you said earlier, right, your interest in evolutionary biology and your identity as a political scientist, do you then also see a continuity here in this process of collaboration across different kinds of biological systems? From, let's say, in case your cancer example, cells interacting together, differentiating in specific ways, to interacting conscious and intentional agents like humans. Do you see a continuum there? Is that also what you are pointing to here?
Yes. Well, I'll give you an example. Cancer involves cells, lines, developing the ability to overcome about 7 or 8 defenses that the host has to keep the cells in line. And the conventional wisdom was that one cell line based on a lot of mutations would develop these abilities to overcome all those defenses. And I came up with an analogy much later, which goes like this. Imagine 2 thieves trying to rob a house. If one of them can pick the lock and the other one can turn off the alarm, they don't both have to have all the capacities to overcome the defenses. And so that's a case of collaboration. It's also an example of cooperation. I worked with a geneticist and a oncologist to develop this concept, see if it was even feasible. Later since been found to be valid in lab experiments that actually happen. So that's collaboration within a tumor.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, you might say the same example can be used to study collaboration. I seem to have lost my pictures here for some reason.
I didn't lose your picture, but now, would you then say that collaboration defined in this way, also with the cancer example, would fit in this broader category of an emergent phenomenon of sort of interacting elements that create a higher level structure?
Yes, absolutely. But I was also going to add that same example of tumors is a collaboration between 3 scientists bringing different things to the table. And so there's collaboration within the tumor and there's collaboration within the academic study of studying that.
But sure, no, I understand that our discussion in that sense is collaborative. But in some sense, if you now bring it to this underlying issue of the commons, right, that is supposedly playing a structuring role in human collaboration, what will be the commons in the case of cancer?
Well, in the cancer case, might say the common evolutionary path of the cells in the tumor are to multiply and increase as they are in every biological system. And some of these cells can be evoking something called VEGF, which encourages capillaries, which encourages blood supply, which encourages oxygen. So one of them might be promoting oxygen in the immediate area, and the other one might be promoting some other nutrient. And so the common purpose, I mean, there's no common purpose defined by the evolutionary process itself, but the result could be the emergent property of a malignant tumor. In the case of typical human collaboration, there's often a specific goal that either has been handed to them as team members or they develop themselves. But notice that the goals of the humans could be quite different. One of them might be after fame and getting credit and promotions within the organization. The other one might be after attempt to try to solve the problem and care more about the problem than their personal credit. So collaboration doesn't necessarily require complete agreement on the goals.
Jenna, go ahead.
Yeah, we've been active in the chat, Bob, because this is raising a lot of super interesting questions for us. So there's a couple of C words, four, I think, that we're throwing around here. We're talking about cooperation, collaboration, the commons, right? But we can also talk about collusion, right? And the existence, I guess, of club goods, excludable goods. So when we're talking about a common interest or common purpose, I'm wondering to what extent, and it's interesting that we're talking about two different systems, the human system where there's, rational forethought, and then this biological system where there isn't. And so we're talking about whether there needs to be completely overlapping common goals, or whether there can be some differentiation in that. And then also at the level of, when we're talking about cancer cells, we have, if the cancer cells are successful, they're actually going to kill the host. So which is going to lead to their own death. So how does that, so that's an interesting thing to unpack. And at the human level, an interesting thing to unpack is to the extent that this interest is held in common across all members of the group, and includes also benefits to those outside of the group. So that's a lot of threads that I've just thrown out there, but just because this is already a quite rich conversation. So any of that you want to pick up on, and I'm sure that my colleagues will follow up on any piece that we want to continue with.
We've already talked a little bit about the first three. On collusion, I see collusion as cooperation in the service of exploiting others. So an example would be two major companies work together to set high prices. And so we call it restraint of trade, and so that kind of business collusion is done often in secret, so that the outsiders who are being disadvantaged don't even necessarily know the collusion is happening.
But is that what the cancer cells are doing then? It's exploitation of others?
Yes.
Okay.
And of course, as
Andreas.
you said, fortunately, the cancer evolutionary process, as you said, is a dead end.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's a tragedy of the commons for the cancer cells, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they're destroying the host that nurtures them.
The better they do, the more likely they're going to kill everything.
Kill their environment. Fortunately, it's not infectious, so they don't kill others, humans.
But they kill themselves.
That's right. Well, yes, that's right. So it reminds me a little bit of climate change.
Yes.
Andreas, you wanted to step in.
Yes. So, Bob, I would like to return to your article, Achieving Cooperation Under Anarchy, Strategies and Institutions from, I think, 1985, right? Which really sets kind of, the ground for a lot of current thinking about collaboration and cooperation. And in that one, you were really using the powers of game theory as a way to outline the kind of dilemmas that one might end up in. Could you maybe start by telling a little bit about, what would be the difference between being in a stag hunt or being in a prisoner's dilemma or in another of these situations when you're mutually trying to collaborate with each other?
Well, collaboration itself could be a prisoner's dilemma. It could be that two members of the team each have an incentive to shirk. That is to say, let the other guy do all the work. But if they both shirk, of course, then the collaboration doesn't accomplish anything. And whereas if they're if the collaboration goes on for some time, either party might say to the other, well, if you shirk, I'll shirk. But if you're willing to give your contribution, then I'll make a contribution too. And we can even play tit for tat, which is to say, I'll start by giving some effort to this collaboration, and then if you cooperate by giving effort as well, then I'll continue. So, but if you start shirking and not giving any effort, then I'll stop too, and then you'll realize that was a losing proposition for both of us. So, even within a collaboration, you could have a prisoner's dilemma between the participants.
But I guess what this suggests is that the understanding of the situation is a critical part of a collaboration, right? Or the mutual understanding of the situation is a critical part of the collaboration.
Well, they can have quite different conceptions of what it's about and what their goals are. They do have to appreciate, however, that the process is interactive. That what I do and what you do jointly determine the payoffs to both of us. They have to at least understand that, so that when the other side stops, so if you stop making effort, you come to realize that the other side might stop too, and that's better than both of you working. But you could have quite different understandings of the situation. I mean, for example, as I say, you might have different goals, and you might have different understandings of what resources are available to the collaborators. You might have different understandings of who your audience is and what you're trying to accomplish. For example, in many organizations, two members of the same team might report to different bosses, and each one of them has the goal of satisfying their own boss. And so they don't necessarily have to have the same goals or even the same understanding of the situation. They have this minimal need to appreciate that if they don't cooperate, the other side probably won't either.
And of course, critical to the game theoretical approaches is the identification of a payoff matrix, right? But in a lot of I guess, real life situations, the payoff matrix is not quite so clear cut. There is a lot of uncertainty with it. And can you say anything about, from your kind of perspective, what do you do or what sustains collaboration then in situations where the payoff matrix might be unknown?
Well, typically, it might have a certain amount of uncertainty and error and noise in judging it, but it's rarely completely unknown. I mean, if it's completely unknown, then you'd have no reason to collaborate because you don't know whether to do you any good or not. So I accept that some uncertainty about exactly what it is common, and some notion even of whether the other guy cooperated recently. Sometimes you're never even sure of that. So there could be misperception and noise. But there has to be some understanding that your choices affect the other side and their choices affect yours. And just from the example from the prisoner's dilemma, you just have to have an understanding that the rank order of the payoffs. So you have to have, in the prisoner's dilemma, what defining feature is that the best payoff for you is if you shirk and the other guy does all the work. The next best is if both of you work. And the next best is if neither of you work. And the worst is if you do all the work and the other guy shirks. And so that's all that you really need for the prisoner's dilemma, is just an understanding of the order of those possibilities, which is pretty common. Namely that you do better by shirking, but you both do better by cooperating.
And now, Bob, do you feel that these kinds of models from game theory, like we now describe in the person's dilemma, are still valid? I mean, they also have been criticized as being caricatures, if you want, of human decision making. Herb Simon already started with this, right? With this whole notion of bounded rationality. There's also more and more evidence that humans are not optimizers always. We don't optimize really for outcome. We might have surprising deviations from that. So do you feel that's still an effective model to look at the kinds of collaboration that we would like to optimize in everyday life and in our world?
Well, traditional game theory and how it began does assume rational actors who have the ability to do foresightful analysis, look ahead. If I do this, you do that, sort of thing. So that's true. But evolutionary game theory has been able to drop the assumption of rationality. So, for example, these cancer cells are not rational. They don't look ahead. They don't do any calculation. But they can still cooperate from an evolutionary perspective, which is to say whatever works well means that they reproduce more. And so the prisoner's dilemma, for example, and game theory in general, no longer require rationality. It's sometimes a useful assumption in order to make predictions. And sometimes the predictions are wrong if the players aren't rational.
But there's a downside to that, right? Because then we sacrifice the goal-directedness, the coordination of human agents in collaborative contexts. And we are back into a more behaviorist perspective on how human behavior comes about, which also has not been a complete success story. Right? So there's a price you then pay if you bring it into this pure evolutionary, non-rational perspective. Or do you feel that's just a necessary step?
Well, for humans, another version of evolutionary, another aspect that's not rational is trial and error learning, where you don't necessarily look ahead, but you experience whether you're doing well or not, and you change behavior if you're not doing well. So learning is trial and error learning is another form of adaptation that humans can do, and of course always do. That's different from rationality, but it's often a very effective thing.
And
but humans
would you
can
say,
go ahead, Jenna. Sorry.
oh no, thank you. Well, because another field that we would want to draw on is psychology here, if we're talking about human decision making, and that if we are not guided by clear incentives in the way that we think that we presume people are, if we assume fully rational thought, humans are still thinking, and their thoughts can often take them wildly off the mark because we can have biases, we have fears, etc. And so, what role does that play? To what extent could we incorporate that into our game theoretic analyses successfully, make it work for us, not against us, as we're trying to understand human collaboration?
Well, let me give you a specific example. Last week, I was 3 weeks ago, I was talking to Chinese and Russian academics and think tank type people on an ongoing discussion of cyber conflict and how to avoid instability. And the point of what I said was, beware of vengeance. So this is one of the psychological features of humans that Jenna was talking about, which is when we feel insulted or exploited or disgraced or punished without reason, we often have a very powerful psychological need for vengeance, which often then we act on without much regard to the costs and benefits. We sort of put all that future-oriented thinking ahead and say, well, vengeance really feels good. I need to do it. And that's very dangerous. And if you're in a realm like cyber conflict, where cyber weapons are used at scale, there's a lot of possibilities that people will feel the need for vengeance if attacked. And the implication, of course, is that we should really be aware of that when we try to understand the consequences of our own actions.
But so is it enough to say beware of vengeance, or is there then some guidance about how to avoid it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the guidance is to take into account what the other side might regard as requiring vengeance. Well, here's a good example. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and then knew that the United States was stronger. But they didn't have a clear understanding of what would happen next, except that for 6 months they would be able to conquer everything in sight. But after that, they'd be short of resources. And I think it's that the United States reaction to Pearl Harbor, among other things, was a strong desire for vengeance. And that kept us going. And in a way where the Japanese thought, well, maybe Americans will let bygones be bygones. They'll take the Philippines and Indonesia and Malaysia and Indochina, but then we'll just let it all regard as a fait accompli. But in fact, we didn't, of course. And I think part of the reason we didn't was vengefulness. So I think the one policy implication is to be cognizant of what the other side, or in this case, America for Japan, what the other side might regard as vengeful action. And if you do it, you better do it with your eyes open. And otherwise, you better avoid it.
But Bob, there's something that I cannot fully understand. Maybe you can explain that, because vengefulness, the wish for revenge, is a very individually defined emotional state. And now we describe it at the level of a nation state.
Well, because it's shared it's shared by lots of individuals. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say the United States was in a vengeful mood. Or after 9/11, we were in a vengeful mode. And of course, we invaded Afghanistan and eventually killed bin Laden. And part of the motivation of Afghanistan was certainly vengeance.
Fine, I understand. But the point is, of course, there are many layers now between that, right? So we have institutions, we have larger groups of humans that all coalesce into something like a nation state. So how would that percolate between these levels? Of course, you can say, well, they respond to the sense of vengefulness in the individual citizen. But still, how is that then incorporated in all the institutional layers that you have to go through?
Well, in this case, I mean, sometimes that can be very complicated. Like you're trying to pass a law to slow down pollution. You have to take into account all those layers. But in some of the cases I've cited, it's very straightforward because in both of those examples, American citizens shared the experience of being attacked. They shared the experience of being feeling that it was not any appropriate response to anything they did. And the leaders felt the same way. And so there was strong support in both of those cases at all levels. So it didn't get complicated. You didn't have to worry about the role of Congress. You didn't have to worry about interest groups and so on. And because there was such a widespread understanding of the situation as calling for vengeance, and there was already identification and loyalty to the nation. So when Pearl Harbor was attacked, it wasn't just Hawaiians that felt attacked. It was all Americans felt attacked. And likewise, in 9/11, it wasn't just New Yorkers that felt attacked. There was already this strong common understanding that the whole of the United States was attacked. And so to summarize that, sometimes the situation is simple enough that you really don't have to worry about all the intervening stages. They're all operate smoothly.
But Bob, there's another aspect to this, right? So Japan was in a systematic war of conquest already since the 1930s. Yeah. Also, when they attacked Pearl Harbor, they were performing many military operations around the Pacific. And they their goal was to knock out the US of the war in one blow, because they hoped to find all the ships there. And in the meantime, in parallel, the United States was in a competition, if you want, also for resources in the Pacific. So I could also give you an alternative interpretation where I say, well, at the nation state level, it was also a competition for control and resource. But to mobilize the citizenry, we use the sense, we enhance the sense of vengeance to mobilize the individuals in our society to actually volunteer to go into the army and sacrifice things so that we can achieve the goals we have as a nation state, which are not the same as vengeance.
Well, I agree that the goals involve resources and power politics, but I'm just saying that the motivation to declare war on Japan on December 7th and not a month before or not a year before, the situation from the American point of view didn't change dramatically in the weeks leading up to Pearl Harbor. So and so the reaction was definitely triggered, you might say, by that event. Now, of course, what we did about it did require leadership, including decisions such as how much of American resources should be devoted to the European theater to fight the Nazis and how much should be devoted to Japan. That does require leadership, and you might study the institutions in order to understand that choice.
So as we're teasing this apart, it almost sounds like there might be two different kinds of psychological processes going on. Maybe at the elite level, we've got a rational calculus of the appropriate actions for the state to take. But because it's a democracy, we need the support of the public. And so the elites can use emotion to get the public on board. Would you say that
that often happens? The clearest case may be the Spanish-American War. Also the Mexican-American War, where the leadership led the way for the public to support the goals of the war. And it wasn't sort of spontaneous from the bottom up the way it was in 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. And certainly the leaders do try to mold public opinion. I remember Roosevelt had a famous line he said to one of the people urging him to take action, he said, well, you convinced me, now go out and convince the public so that they will force me to do it, or another way, to support me doing it. So there are certainly complex interactions between the public and the leadership. And once you get into that, then you might well need to get into the institutional structures that mediate that difference, such as elections or the legislature.
Yeah. And the public, I mean, it may be that they're unable to see as clearly as the elites our interests in acting or not acting. But then it's also probably the case that an awful lot of information cannot be shared with the public. So there's covert information that just can't be released. Do you think, of course, in our country, Bob, we're all sort of thinking about the implications of the United States pulling out of Afghanistan. Do you think that this dynamic that you've been describing with Japan is happening in reverse in Afghanistan, in the sense that the public just can't see our common interest in being present in Afghanistan anymore, and the leadership isn't able to make a convincing, compelling argument to bring the public along?
Well, in this case, I don't think the leadership of the Biden administration sees value in continuing the war. I don't think that they feel compelled by a public. I think they felt that they had quite a lot of choice about whether to declare a date by which they would withdraw. I also you made a comment about how to the effect that the elites are rational, and I would say not necessarily. I mean, they sometimes make choices that that after the fact we think were made for bad reasons, and not just bad information, but just not very carefully thought out. I mean, I've already mentioned the Japanese case. I thought that was an irrational decision. But, well, so
Yes.
another thing about to make a comment about Jenna's statement that sometimes the leaders can't share information. That's true. And then one of the factors that come into play is trust. Does the public trust the leaders? If they say this is the thing what the United States should do, trust me, do they trust them? And I think a major loss in the last 4 years in the United States is a decline in trust of government, for good reason.
Bob, it would be great to develop this notion of trust a bit further, because it seems to be critical both when dealing with, an uncertain situation or an uncertain payoff. It also seems to be critical in, so to say, linking up the individual level and the institutional level. So could you say also theoretically a bit more about what are you thinking about trust in terms of importance for collaboration, and how has the importance of trust or the understanding of the role of trust changed over the last years in your thinking?
Well, typically trust or collaboration does require trust. It requires trust that the other person will give an honest effort, show up and do their part. Before you actually find out if that's true, you can commit yourself to participating in this activity, trusting that it will be mutually valuable. In international affairs, in the cyber context, the Russians and Chinese have told the Americans that trust is perhaps the most important thing in order to make progress in avoiding war and escalation. And game theory has done some work on what is required to build trust, but I think it has a lot more to offer. And certainly collaboration, as I said, and requires a certain amount of trust.
And trust, I guess, is also related to another critical issue, which has to do with the temporal extension of the collaboration or the exchange, doesn't it? Because trust seems also to be about projecting into a future. So is that an area to develop further, also theoretically, the relation between, you can say, future thinking and trust?
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the major conclusions of my work on cooperation was the importance of what I call the shadow of the future. The idea that both sides know that there's going to be a continuing relationship, and in economic terms, that they don't discount the future too much, that they find the future is worth worrying about and worth sacrificing today by, say, taking a chance on trust in order to see if you can get the long-term benefits. So trust definitely can be built up by an appreciation that you're in this for the long term.
So Bob, we looked at a number of key features now, right? So the last one being trust, and then also the shadow of the future. But if we want to put these all together in a comprehensive framework, we could argue that also that collaborative system that we also just described, going from citizens through institutions to a president, in the end has some sort of architecture, right? Where we have a functional decomposition, we have protocols of communication, we have mechanisms in which incentives are distributed through the system and so on. So would you see it in those terms? Okay, do you think we can look at collaborative processes from that perspective of an architecture? And if so, what would the main features of that architecture be?
Well, one of the main features of the architecture is the extent to which the goals are set by an outside agent, such as the boss within an organization, um, to the extent that the two members of the collaborative team are working for the same boss and have the goal of making the boss happy with their work. That's a pretty strong architecture and a pretty strong way of setting goals and monitoring them. But often, the participants in the collaboration don't have a common boss that sets the terms of the collaboration, and they've got to work that out together.
So
Sometimes
you would see
sometimes explicitly, such as, for example, if there's a treaty between two countries or a memorandum of understanding or a contract between two companies. I'll provide this if you provide that. So sometimes it's formalized between the participants themselves, but often it's less structured by a good deal. There's a handshake. Oh, let's work on this together. And there's no formal contract, and there's not necessarily a detailed definition of what this is that we're working on, or how much you'll do and how much I'll do. Sometimes there's collaboration. There's an explicit statement that I'll provide this if you provide that, based often on specialization. So, for example, when I collaborated with evolutionary biologist William Hamilton to develop the biological implications of the prisoner's dilemma, we had an understanding of what his strong suit was, and he could provide lots of examples from biology for what I was talking about. I could provide some of the results of my computer tournaments and analyze them. And we shared a common interest and understanding of both evolutionary theory and game theory. And that helped us work together effectively, even though our backgrounds, he knew a lot about beetles and I knew a lot about war. And those two knowledge bases didn't overlap.
Right. But now, if I understand you right, Bob, then you're saying there is a hierarchical structure of goals and sub-goals, if you want. But now, for the agents in the system to pursue those goals, we have something like trust, which also means by implication, we assume that all these agents have a theory of mind. Because that's why you need trust, because you have a model of the other agent that says, well, they can do bad things, they can do good things. And I just make the assumption they will do good things. That's trust, right? So now that already gives us elements of this architecture, but now you have protocols of communication, right? That both has to run within layers and between layers. So do you have a specific view on what the features of that kind of communication structure then should be to maintain your goal structure?
Well, it's often said that a major impediment to interdisciplinary collaboration is that the two sides don't speak the same language. So when I started working on cancer, I certainly didn't speak the language of the cancer specialists. And there's a huge variety of specialized terms. You don't have to master the 6,000 terms that are in the index of a major cancer textbook, but you do have to understand a lot of, you have to learn a lot about what P53 is, for example, and why it's important. And VEGF and a million, several hundred other things. And so developing mutual understanding is often part of the collaborative process.
Andreas.
Yeah, so Bob, I think this is very interesting that the moment we started out with architectures, but the moment we go to the scientific collaborations, we are, so to say, back again in this more anarchistic realm, where there is not a clear hierarchy of a shared boss and a shared goal, and yet people figure out ways of collaborating. So is it maybe, it's time to think a little bit more about what does it take for these interdisciplinary collaborations to actually work? Is there still kind of a commitment to some overarching shared goal or shared cause, be it, the advent, the advent of knowledge or the increase of knowledge that stabilizes it? Or what does it then take for these agents who are in very separate systems actually to create this space in the middle between them? And I think the interdisciplinary collaborations are really interesting instances of that.
Well, in the cases of my collaborations, which I think are typical, although they're much more heavily interdisciplinary than most collaborations are, the project started with the shared goal of achieving new understanding of a better understanding of some phenomena in the outside world, such as, say, an arms race or cancer, and that the intention usually is among academics is that this would lead to at least one publication, and that's a concrete output of this collaboration. Sometimes part of the goal is just having fun. I find it fun to work with people that know a lot of things that I don't know, and to understand their perspective. And a lot of science, of course, is driven by curiosity and the desire to kind of play with ideas and concepts, obviously with the purpose behind that of advancing our understanding and knowledge, but not necessarily a material purpose, such as getting a raise.
So in your background for us, you shared your presidential address to the American Political Science Association called Political Science and Beyond. And in that one, you also talk about, the 4 ups that you need to cultivate as a researcher. It's reading up on a variety of fields. It's teaming up with others. It's about loading up on research related to your problem. And it's about lighting up when you need to escape from the problem for a while. So with 4 principles, in a sense, also count as general principles that are useful to initiate collaborations, because each of them, in a sense, seems to assume that you need to bring yourself into a particular state to allow these kind of collaborations to happen.
Well, yes, and you certainly, I call those things the 4 ups, and they're on my website, and people want to check out what they mean. I think the most interesting is the last one, the lighten up. And one of the points I make, which I found in myself, is that when either in a collaboration or working on your own, you get to a dead end, you beat your head against the wall. It pays to lighten up. It pays to back off and sleep on it, turn to some other project for a while, in order to get out of the current mode of thinking that you're stuck with.
So, Bob, that makes me think a little bit more about what would cause a collaboration that ought to continue to fail. And so, or another way of thinking about that is what makes a collaboration robust. So what is it? So, in your sense, what do you think about what causes something to fail, or what would, or alternatively, how could you structure it so that it would be able to continue despite being hit by, in this sense, maybe people's distraction from other projects that are pulling them away?
Well, I'll give you one example of a failure that I was involved with, which is this story about cooperation among cancer cells, done with Dr. Kenneth Pieta. So when we sent that off to a major journal, we got 2 reviews. And of course, what we were doing was somewhat speculative. And one review says it's impossible what they're proposing, this kind of cooperation. And the other reviewers say, oh, everybody knows it's in this already. So obviously that was a failure. It was a failure to get the thing published in that journal. And it was also a failure of our ability to communicate what we were trying to do, to show that it wasn't impossible and it was different from what people already knew. And the way we proceeded was to give up on that journal and take responsibility for explaining what's new here and why it was at least possible. And so it took a certain amount of perseverance. But when you got reviews that said it's impossible, but everybody knows it already, that was pretty discouraging.
Yeah. Um,
Bob,
go ahead, Paul.
if I could just then follow up on this one, because, this notion of lighten up, as you say, seems to be critically important to actually keep collaborations going, right? Now, if we are to return to the payoff matrix, is there a payoff matrix of lightening up? Or how do we think of something like the lightening up in terms of an economic gain? Because it seems to open for a very different dimension that precisely is about exploring trust, exploring kind of a long-term being in the game together, exploring ways of, in a sense, creating a shared understanding or exploring the shared understanding. Does that have a payoff matrix in a more traditional sense, or how do we think of it?
Well, I would think of it as not in the payoffs, but in the discount rate. That is to say, how patient or impatient are you? How much does the future depend? How much does the future count? As opposed to getting immediate awards. And if the collaboration, for example, if it's set up in a business organization where you have 1 month in order to increase profits or else you're a failure, well, then obviously you can't lighten up. You've got to work hard on that problem. But if you take a long-term perspective because your discount rate isn't too high because you value the future, then you might come to the conclusion with your colleagues in the collaboration that what you're doing now isn't working. And you ought to step back and for example, examine the premises, examine why you structured the search for a solution in the way you did, or whether there's other ideas that are completely different from the ones that you've been trying to build on. And so I see it not so much a change the payoff matrix as a change in the discount rate and awareness and a realization that you don't that to make progress. You might have to give up making progress in the short run, which wasn't working anyway, in order to do some more exploration of distant possibilities that might pay off later.
Thank you.
So I have. So that actually makes me think a lot about Jim March's excellent work on exploration versus exploitation. But there's another way of thinking about this and thinking about Andreas's question, which reminds me, in fact, about a point that you made earlier, Bob, when you were talking about kind of the fun of working on a project. And part of that fun is working with other people. Now, this we don't typically think about when we're doing game theoretic analyses. Generally, in game theory, we think in terms of extrinsic rewards. But there's also an intrinsic reward. And here I'm thinking in particular about the Bach group, which is for everyone else. This is a group that Bob was a part of for a long time, a beautiful collaboration in a sense, a meeting of fellow scientists that I don't think had a specific purpose other than being a place where you could share ideas in progress. And so you didn't have a sense of a definite goal beyond that in terms of a common publication. And yet it was incredibly important to all of you who were participating in it. And so a big part of that was the connection between fellow human beings. So what role do you think this connectedness between humans plays in fostering collaboration, successful collaboration, and getting you over some hurdles and making it more robust?
Well, you're quite right to emphasize the importance of human relationships, and in particular in collaboration, what could be fun of working with some other people. There's been work, for example, on political mobilization, such as working for a candidate or a party or a cause. And what's often found in that setting is that people get together for a purpose of accomplishing something, for example, women's rights or sustainability environment. But they often stay because of the personal rewards of working with like-minded people. So it can often be an extrinsic motivation for a common cause, but that the sustaining feature is that they enjoy working together. It's sort of like it could be a club. And what often helps promote successful collaboration is if at least one of the members explicitly attend to the interpersonal relations. For example, saying to somebody, you've contributed a lot, but why don't you listen to other people a little bit better? Well, I'm not very good at being tactful, so that's a bad way to put it. But there's often been found in collaborative groups that one person takes on the role of a task leader, focusing on the task, and somebody else typically takes the role of a solidarity leader who is attentive to the interpersonal relationships and works to keep those on keel.
So, Bob, so on the one hand, just a quick reaction to the issue of the lightening up. It's very reminiscent of this idea of incubation that goes back to the theory of creativity of Helmholtz, right? Where it's like you expose yourself to something, and then there's a period of distancing, of incubation, after which insight would follow. And I find it a curious overlap, which might be worth pursuing on some other occasion. On the other hand, if I listen to you, I also feel that there's a collision here in conceptualizations and interpretations, because when we talked about the cancer example and how it informs us about human collaboration, we actually went into a model which would deny intentionality and goal setting playing a role, because it would play out as a biological mechanical process. However, when I asked you about the architecture of collaboration, the first thing you said was goals. So I see a bit of a gap between these two positions that to me also show that there's still a lot of work to be done in this field of understanding collaboration. So that would say, what would you see as the most critical question that we have to answer to make progress on this topic?
Well, that's a big question. And what's the most critical question to answer to make progress on this topic? Was what you said. And I'd say to deal with that, we should lighten up. As to say, not try to give a 30-second answer right off the top of my head, but thinking about what's the most critical question. Well,
but Bob, there's another thing about creativity, what Pasteur called the prepared mind, right? So I'd hoped that it would just come out like that, because you cannot sleep at night because of that one question you need to answer.
That's sometimes true. Sometimes you have a question that you're pondering and that just bothers you. I had such a thing in graduate school when I was wondering, based on game theory, how would you measure whether a situation is very much like a zero-sum game, or is it very much like a partnership game where the interests are completely aligned and whatever helps one helps the other, where zero-sum, of course, whatever helps one hurts the other? And how would you measure that? And I couldn't do it. But I put it aside, and several years later, I came back to ponder it again. And when I woke up one morning, I had what I regarded as the answer, and the mathematical proof that it was met all the conditions, and it was the only measure that didn't meet all the conditions. And then I said, well, why did it take me so long? And the answer, it turned out, is I had to forget something. One of the factors I thought that you could put into this turned out to be irrelevant, and you don't need it. And after several years, when I came back to the problem, I didn't bother. I didn't remind myself of that, and that was good. So even when you have a question that's really bothering you, lightening up can be very helpful.
Right. So my last two questions to bring us to the finish line. Do you believe that humans will ever manage to maintain sustainable collaboration?
Well, that's yes, in some regards. I mean, to take an example, we have a sustainable collaboration about what the U.S. dollar means. Any place in the world, you can hand a person a U.S. dollar, and they'll give you an apple or whatever. So there's understanding. It's just a piece of paper. Why should anybody take a green piece of paper and give you an apple? They're not going to eat the paper. And the reason, of course, is that we all have a common understanding that somebody else will they can use that piece of paper to buy shoes or whatever. So there's an example, and that's sustainable. It's been around for a long time, certainly a dominant world currency for almost 100 years, and it's likely to be sustained for quite a while. Maybe not the only major currency that's universally recognized, but so there's an example of sustainable understanding of a situation that promotes collaboration at a very high level. Now, we need to have a sustained collaboration on climate change. And that's a toughie because everybody wants to burn coal because it's the cheapest source of energy today. But of course, it's terrible. And so we can talk to each other and say, oh, we'll try to reduce our coal if you try to reduce your coal. But there's no formal agreement or mutual monitoring or punishments for violation of the trust. And so there's a case where sustainable cooperation is absolutely essential, but it's really, really hard, partly because we're organized into the nation states.
And then so if you now would be able to change one feature of humans, anything, through magic, what would that one feature be?
Do nothing. And the reason I say that is if you change something, I don't know that would actually be an improvement considering all the very difficult to understand side effects.
Right.
So I don't know. You might think, well, I'd like to eliminate disease. Well, but then if people live much, much longer, that there's a lot of things to think about how good that is. So that's why I say if I was to change one thing, I'd do nothing.
Great. Bob Axelrod, thank you very much for this conversation. Hi, you listened to one of our podcasts in the series on collaboration, produced by the Instrument Forum and the Convergent Science Network. You can find more episodes on our website.